Hello, hi. I'm sorry, we were supposed to be live, but because of many factors, we weren't. But still, we are, and we have Bill Clegg with us. Hi, Bill.
How you doing?
We have also it's very nice to see you and to meet you, and it's a great honor to speak with you about your book, which was published just in Poland, Koniec dnia, the end of the day, translated into Polish by Dobromiła Jankowska and published by Wydawnictwo Pauza. And it's also a great honor to have you, Anita Musio, the head of Wydawnictwo Pauza, with us.
Hi, nice to see you all.
And just before our conversation with Bill, I'd like to give the floor just for a few minutes to Anita, and if you could say some words as an introduction to our conversation, it would be very nice of you.
Yes, I would love to. I just published The End of the Day, Koniec dnia, as Marcin said, which is a beautiful story about friendship and about the past and how it shapes us and how our lives shape us over time and over all the events that happen. And to me, to a degree, it's a story about how we don't really ever know people 100%. We don't really know what lies underneath, and we don't always know the truth, even if we think we do, which is pretty key in friendships, I think, where people think they know the other person, they know the whole story, but sometimes they don't. So I was showing Bill before because due to the pandemic, I couldn't send him hard copies of the book. So we have two clues at the beginning of the book. This is Dana's briefcase. And when you're reading, you can think about why it's important and what stories it holds. And at the end, we have the sunset and the sea, which is a wonderful way for the book to close. But I didn't really want to talk about this book now. I just wanted to say why I decided to publish Bill's first book when I was working in my previous job at Wydawnictwo WB, and I published Did You Ever Have a Family, which absolutely captivated me. And I just wanted to read a short passage because this is the passage at the end of the book that I read, and I knew at that moment that I had to publish it. And I knew I would always want to publish everything that Bill Clegg probably ever wrote, unless he started writing science fiction or something completely different, which I don't think will happen.
Not likely.
No. So the part is, and I'm going to read just a very short fragment. And no one will remember us, who we were, or what happened here. Sand will blow across Pacific Avenue and against the windows of the Moonstone, and new people will arrive and walk down the beach to the great ocean. They will be in love or they will be lost, and they will have no words, and the waves will sound to them as they did to us the first time we heard them. So every time I read this, I start crying, which is just about to happen now. But I think this is everything to me that is important in literature is in that piece of writing. So I absolutely adored the book, and I knew that this was something I wanted to publish, and I did. And now, several years later, along comes the end of the day, and I was really waiting for it to come, and I'm very, very proud to be able to be Bill's publisher. So thank you, and have a great conversation. I'll be listening and the whole time.
Thanks, Anita.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anita. Yes, I totally agree with Anita, and I'm also captivated by both of your book, and also I read a non-fiction book. It's another story, but I'd like to focus on the end of the day. But actually, I think we cannot start about speaking about this book not mentioned about Did You Ever Have a Family, because because Jackie, one of the main character in your newest book, is also a character, but not main character. Was character in did you ever have a family? And of course, it sometimes happens, but it's not so often. Just to this kind of joints between books. But mm, yeah, this Jackie. Yeah, because there are also many characters in this book which I'd love to read in the future. But let's leave it for later. But why did you choose Jackie? Why did you stay with Jackie as a character? So what did it happen that you decided to make her the main character in the new book?
Yeah, it wasn't so much a decision at first. It was a curiosity. I mean, she appears toward the beginning of Did You Ever Have a Family? She's the mother of a peripheral character in Did You Ever Have a Family? And he turns up in his mother's driveway at the occasion of a very sad event, and she comes out in her little house coat, and the porch light is on, and she comes to his car, and she's sort of consoling her son. And I don't, she barely makes an appearance in the book, and yet there was something about her when I was writing the book. I just was curious about her, and she seemed lonely to me, um, and in her late 60s, and I just started writing her, and for a while I thought that her son and she and that family might figure into Did You Ever Have a Family? And but very quickly it became clear that they had no place. Like, Rick has a brief appearance, and so as I was writing Did You Ever Have a Family, like I sometimes write myself into corners, like where I don't see what to do next, or I've created a kind of booby trap. And so what I would do is I would just jump into this file with Jackie, and her childhood friend came up, Dana, this house that she grew up in the shadow of, her parents, and just this world. I mean, it's the same town as Did You Ever Have a Family, but a completely different world within that town. And so for, several years, I just would kind of return to those pages, almost as a sort of, just as a plaything, just because I was satisfying a curiosity more than anything else. And then I left them behind for a little while and finished Did You Ever Have a Family? But there was enough of a center of gravity established around her and around this friendship with her neighbor, that when I don't always have the urge to write, because I have a pretty full-time day job as a literary agent. But I kept on coming back to it, curious, and then I just decided not to legislate it any longer, and I just kind of dove in, and I'm glad I did. So, but that's how it happened. I just sort of backed into it without realizing that I was writing another novel.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I have many threads about your book, which I'd like to hear from you. But if I have you, I'm also interested in process of writing. And for example, the first sentence, which for me is one of the most beautiful, but also very important, I would say, for the topic of the book, but also for something else. I don't want to say everything, because for the readers, I'm thinking about the readers. But the first sentence, I'm sorry for that, because I read it in Polish, and now I will translate it from Polish into English. But it's the knocking at the door is faint and uncertain, right? Or yes?
I can read it. It's right here. It's like the
Please.
tapping at the door is so faint and tentative, it's easy to pretend it's not happening.
Yeah, and the question is quite easy, but maybe not. When did this sentence come to you? At what stage of writing?
Later. And it was later. I had written Jackie, and and then and then I'd even written sort of some stuff around around the horse stables and how they met and things like that. And then so maybe it wasn't until I went back and recognized that, like, okay, I'm gonna write this. This is there's no turning back. And then once I had made that decision, I really started thinking about Dana, who was her childhood friend, and I remember where I was when I wrote it. I was sitting at the kitchen table in our house, which I come to when I write. We normally live in the city, and this house is 90 minutes north of the city, and I just imagined her at Jackie's age. Like, it was the first time I had imagined her as someone in her late 60s. And I had no idea what had happened in her life at that point. I just imagined her with somebody at the door, and that she was reluctant to even acknowledge that there was something that she had to respond to. And that the luxury of that, like being, kind of sort of inside a very luxurious situation, like where there's staff in the house, and almost resenting like the world that she's in. And I also just intuited immediately that she was very lonely. And so that's where that sentence came from.
Because it's I think this is, if I so just maybe I'm wrong, so this is the question, but for me one of the most important topic of your book is the past, in a way. And it was very, because when I researched and also read a lot of reviews of your book, because it was published last year in the United States, so there were some reviews, and Joseph Peschel or Pascal in the Boston Globe wrote that the past is a ticking bomb, writing about your book. And ticking and knocking, and the past, so the past is something dangerous, something. And so the past, this point about the past is good thinking. So the past is a very important topic also for you.
And so that's the thing about writing, is you write something from a moment of like just instinct, and then you recognize how it might serve all sorts of other ideas, like related to the book. And so for Dana, that past was something that she didn't want to come back to her, and it was sort of thrust on her. But it's my experience of the past in general, which is that things that happen to us in our long history and near history oftentimes are sort of like, especially things from our long history, our childhoods, we sometimes don't even want to acknowledge that they're there, but they often are running the show. Like, what I mean? Just like those wounds, those those prejudices, those fears, they underlie so much of what happens in our day-to-day life, oftentimes without claiming credit, and the fingerprints of the past are not always on them, but they're there. And so that moment of her, kind of, it's almost like it's not there, but it's always there. And so I later recognized the use of that first sentence in terms of the whole book. So that's a very good example of how I write, which is like, not like I write just from instinct, and then cut and revise, but the things that sort of come out that sort of matter to the larger project stay.
And what about the characters? I mean, I would ask you a little about, let's say, after Judith Butler, gender trouble, because for me, you prefer more female characters. I mean,
I know.
You know that. So, but
and I don't. It's not a decision. Again, it's like, I think on some level, I find sort of the interior lives of women more interesting than men. And I'm more curious about women. I'm more curious about what drives them, what shapes their experience, maybe out of a simultaneous identification as a gay man. I think I identify in some way with women. But on the other hand, I think that there is something completely unknowable about that experience. I think to occupy a female body is an unknowable thing for me. Like, I can't speak to other men or but I know for me, I don't know what that experience is like. But and what that, the vulnerability of that, the power of that, I don't, but I imagine into it. And so, yeah, women capture my imagination more than men in terms of characters, which doesn't mean that men don't. It's just that I find that the beginning of something, Did You Ever Have a Family began with, I just imagined this woman leaving a town in a car on a road that I knew very well, like along a river, and with a great sense of regret and grief, but mainly regret, like that there was just that she was gripped by regret, and I had no idea why or what. But then, but just that circumstance of this woman led to Did You Ever Have a Family? That's the doorway in for me. There would be no book without that initial curiosity. And the same with Jackie. It's like I was just like, who is this woman? Like, she seems like a working class older woman. She's like approaching 70. She lives alone. And probably to most people, she seems like very boring and that there's not much going on. But like, I just sensed there was just like some big, even if it all took place in this town and in that house, that there was like an epic story there of some kind. And I wanted to know what it was.
I have to admit that I love Lupita. I love her, yeah, and being with her was probably, at least for me, the most emotional, because you know why, probably, and the readers they do also. But well, I'm a little bit worried that you said that the female characters are more interesting because, for example, Mo, one of the male character, you're right. Just you say something, but I think it wasn't enough. And this is the person who I'd love to read more in the future, maybe from you. But yeah. So the question is about, I don't know, because it's tricky question, but what was the hardest for you to write about in regards to character? Because I started from Lupita, and many scenes with Lupita were very hard to read, obviously, and yeah. So
She was the hardest. I mean, she's one of the hardest characters and on some level the hardest, and on other levels not hard at all, in the sense that she arrived as a character to me pretty fully hatched. Like once she occurred to me, I just like, she became, I feel like I knew her, I saw her, I identified with her in many ways. She's from Mexico. She came into the country at a very young age, and she's the only Latinx person in the town, and so her personal history doesn't resemble anybody else's that she is in contact with, except her own family. And so she's very isolated. And I grew up in a town that looks very much like Wells in the book. And so I was, closeted, and even to the point of I was closeted even to myself, but I had a very profound sense of otherness growing up there. And so I never felt like fully like I belonged in any group or anywhere there. And so I think that's the common ground that I have with her. There's so much that I could never know. And so the hard part, but what was also like the most interesting part, was doing a lot of research into immigration from Mexico into the United States during that period in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and what the laws were, how her father came into the country first in Florida, where they lived before coming to Connecticut. And I read a lot of oral histories, a lot of first-person accounts, and then academic books about like the period. And then I just wrote what I wrote and once I had finished a draft, I started sharing it with people who had something close to her experience. And in one case, the girlfriend of a friend of mine had come into the country at the exact same age that Lupita did, came to a section of Queens in New York, but had been bullied very similarly to Lupita. And I had no idea about her actual, I knew that she'd come into the country at a young age. She read the book and we spoke for hours about just her experience and what she identified within Lupita's and things that hadn't occurred to me. And I did that with a number of people of different ages, just so that like I wanted to be completely respectful to that experience, which is not my own. And so I listened and changed, and it informed changes that I made before the book got published. So yeah, but so it was the most involved and the most interesting. But I never was frustrated. I was always only ever. I just had a lot of compassion for her and identification and love.
Yeah, me too. So thank you for Lupita. And speaking about research, because it's set in the 60s in the United States, so it's,
yeah,
I would say, golden times in a way. But you look at these times from perspective of, for example, otherness, and so it's not very clear. It's I wouldn't use this this American dream. So, but it's also about clashes of imagination of the times of the history. I would say. But still, there are many, for example, songs or we have Marlon Brando and Judy Garland and people like that. So very, very important people, not only for American dreams, but also for general imagination, not only in America, but we know, I mean, in Poland, we know these stars. So in a way, probably this is the question, was also to make research great fun for you, because you have to watch, for example, some movies from the past or listen to the Beatles or something.
I did. I mean, I imagined, between Dana and Jackie as, teenage girls growing up together, and like what kind of music would they listen to, and that was really, and what TV shows were they watching? I mean, even their prom dresses, I spent so much time going back into, because there's a scene where they go to New York and they pick out prom dresses, and I looked at the year and what high school girls were wearing for prom dresses in America at the time, and all that stuff was just like, exciting. It was I enjoyed going through that, and I tried a lot to just anchor the perspective of these characters in that time, and not my own experience of growing up in the 1970s and 80s in a very similar town. And yet, like, these differences culturally, absolutely. But the thing about those towns, and I think the reason why I keep on going back to exploring the experience of growing up in a small town, is how so much has not changed, and how so much is the same about like these communities and the experience of living there. It's so different in so many ways, mainly because of the internet, because there's access to other worlds. I think the thing that has, but growing up as they did in the 1960s, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, like it was in some ways like very, very similar, because we didn't have the internet, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't even have really TV. And so I didn't know the difference between the New York Times and the New Yorker when I moved to New York, and worked for a literary agent who represented the man who would go on to become the editor of the New Yorker. And I just, so those places were still, kind of in some ways for people who grew up there, very limited.
Mm. Yeah, for me, your book, I'm happy and thank you that you're speaking about it, because for me, your book was also a novel about the divisions between the province in a way and the center, between also being different and being in the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but it's well, it's ongoing process, because it's like as you said, you have to write about it all the time, because now you are in the different world, if I can use these words,
Yeah.
if you know what I mean. But the strange and paradoxical thing is that you think so much about, the other words, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have people in my life, I've had people in my life too, who are no longer with us, who are much older. And I've always been like drawn to like older people. And so, and what I loved hearing the stories about, somebody who is in their 80s, who maybe has difficulty getting into the restaurant and sitting down, and but then you hear their stories about when they were in their 20s, and they had, and what was going on culturally at the time, and what mattered to them, and what still matters to them. And I think I'm always fascinated to see, sort of like the journeys that people take to get to these places that, like, I mean, Anita said it earlier, like, we truly don't know anybody else's experience. It's impossible to know that. But we make such, I mean, the biggest problem with our country right now in many ways is how there's an expectation of knowing what people are like based on what they see, whether it's the color of their skin or, and so, so I think the more we like work to remind ourselves that we have no idea of like what people are and how they are and who they are and where they've been based on just a first glance, like it's the worst mistake that we can make. And so spending time unpacking, as best as one can, like what the story is that leads up to the moment where one might make a flash decision about them. Like that's the project of fiction that I enjoy the most and get the most out of.
Mm. I noticed during reading the end of the day that you love to write about details. I mean, all the details are very important, which is very, and I totally agree. And I love also because details are very important for non-fiction writers, because of someone tiny thing you can say, the whole story about the whole world. Uh, but why is it so important for you? I mean, this is only the part of the question, because the second is that the thing, tiny thing, or the things might be very, dangerous, because sometimes it reminds you about something, and it can remind you about the past.
Mm.
So, this is that there is something unclear in this magic of thing, because sometimes you want to put away all the things, because
Mm.
they can remind the past or something. But you love the details. Why? Because when you write all the time about some, I don't know, when you highlight the elements of the past, they can disappear in a moment, in the process of psychotherapy, because when you repeat all the time all the things, it's not, they are not frightened as it was not,
Mm.
not named, or just tell me.
don't know. I mean, I think I understand the question. The details for me are also part of, I spent a lot of time on, the house, Edgeweather, the furniture and who designed the mirrors and where some of the art came from, and part of that is that imagining, Dana imagines her great grandfather. She's thinking about her great grandfather and how he built the house to kind of woo this woman who probably didn't love him, and so I went back and just sort of read, sort of these accounts of, wealthy Americans building houses at that period of time, and who the architects were and who they were like trying, who was in fashion, and so part of that is also like understanding like where this character Dana is coming from, and she has a relationship to her great grandfather through this picture, which over the course of the book changes, and so the details in that case matter a lot, because I feel like it's like that house is emblematic of something. I think everybody in the story has a relationship to that house, and their relationship to that house changes, just like Dana's relationship to the image of her great grandfather in the painting in the dining room changes. And so for me, it's all about like for me, if I'm reading a novel, I want to believe it. And so if the details aren't believable, and if the details aren't authentic, then sometimes I just kind of lose interest. And so, but these things interest me, and all I can hope is that they can interest people as well as they're reading.
They totally do, at least at least me. But I was asking about it because it's astonishing, because well, when you start to read Bill Clegg's book, it seems to you that you write about people, but being very careful, looking at the world you create, you see very important, I would say, non-human existence world. And as you mentioned about house, but also many other details, and also I would say nature also is quite interesting thing for you. But I was very sad that you use horses, but there aren't any non-human animals. But okay, so
there's not a lot of animals in my books.
Okay, yeah, but it's
I don't know how to write pets or like animals. Like it's not, yeah. It's a challenge. I'll take it. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. But yeah. So I'm tempted to ask you if you're thinking of expanding of these points of this, looking at the things from non-human perspective, because it's also, I think, it's sometimes which you can do it. I think, as Anita said about science fiction books. So just the idea.
I don't know. I mean, I think like it's the things that are in our lives, like the houses, the clothes, the ornaments like that are on a desk, like all those like sort of inanimate objects also tell a story about the characters. So, and what people are wearing, in the case of Lupita going, she would sneak into the house and try on the clothes of this rich girl who lived next to her, whose life she couldn't even begin to imagine. And so, but she tried to imagine into it by wearing her clothes, and it was almost like an erotic experience for her. And so I grew up in a small town and I was a landscaper, a gardener, and I worked for wealthy people who were often not in their house. They were in New York or elsewhere. And so I had keys to all those houses. And so let's just say like that, I did the research for years to write those scenes with Lupita, like trying on the clothes of like the next door neighbor. And and those things, like literally the underwear that Dana has in her drawers, like they wouldn't even occur to Lupita. I mean, like just the luxury of them, the detail of them, they come from another planet in some ways, and yet the two of them live within a short walk from each other. And so at the time, like when you're young, and for Lupita, it feels so incredibly important and transporting. It actually transports her. And I remember that belief in physical objects having that power when I was younger, and I can feel it still as an adult. And I think we do feel that as an adult still, but I think that's part of what it is. I think these houses or underwear or cars, whatever, they hold a certain kind of power.
Yeah, this might sound serious in a way. It is, but I'd like to ask you about the family, because uh, for me, you create not only you, but also we have. I mean, when you speak into to Polish readers, but also readers in a world, the family word, I think, has changed for years, for decades, and
Yeah.
what does nowadays for you, not only as a writer but also as a person, as a gay in a marriage, and human in a context, what does this word family mean for you? Does it have any sense? Because you use it, of course, and we all use it, but yeah, what does it mean?
I mean, it means a lot of things. I think for me, right now, family means my husband and my niece, who we are raising. We have we're raising my brother's daughter, who is now 6.5. She came to live with us when she was 2 years old. My brother and his ex-girlfriend were not in a position to raise her, and in order to avoid foster care, we intervened and have been raising her, and we're in the middle of adopting her. And in the pandemic this year, she'd been living with us for years, but like in New York, we have incredibly busy lives, and so we would come home and put her to bed, and then start another day and walk her to school, and then we would see her at 7 o'clock. In the pandemic, living in this house, we eat dinner together every night, which we did not before. We ate dinner one night a week together on Saturday night. Now we eat every meal together. And so my experience of a family is much different. It's actually like when I used to think of families that I admired or were jealous of, there was a quality of almost like us against them, like this sort of team, like this sort of family that had this kind of like strength of unity, and didn't matter what was going on outside the unit. And I longed for that, because my family growing up sort of tore each other apart. And so we were not on the same team. And we eventually got to the same team much later as adults. But like in my growing up years, we had to survive the family and the world outside. And now in our case, it feels like a team. It feels like, it doesn't really matter. Like, it's like, and I'm so grateful for the pandemic for that. I hate that people have died, and I hate what it has meant to so many people's lives. But one positive thing that's come out of it for us is just a kind of like a reimagining of like what family is to us, and our responsibility to it. And I don't want to go back to the way it was. I really don't. And I think I don't think I ever thought that I could have that experience of being in a family that had that sort of us against them kind of cohesion and unity. And here I've felt it for the first time.
it's obvious that that I read quite a bit about your biography, and the natural reflex was then to apply the plot of the novel to your story in a way. But you but you make some comments, so it's obvious, no mystery. But the question is about again about process of writing, because yeah, I was wondering if the writing is for you a moment of escape from reality, or rather a moment of coming, to to your own story, and to rewrite it in an artistic way or something, to put new things, new perspective.
Hmm. Well, in the case of, I mean, I started writing this, the end of the day, years before my niece came into our lives. And so when she came in, I stopped writing because there was no time for anything else. It was like we had a 2-year-old. We were these two gay guys who lived in Manhattan, in Greenwich Village. We had no idea what to do with a little girl. We had no idea how to raise a child. And we just suddenly had a 2-year-old who had been ripped from from her parents. And so I didn't think about writing for a year. And then when I went back into the book, without giving away the plot of the book, let's just say there's a child in the book that needs to be raised. And I had already written that. And I was like, oh God, it's like, I almost like, it was like a prophecy. It was like, how did I wrote this into existence? But I will say that having then a child in my life, and also the experience of being a parent who wasn't a biological parent, it really shaped so much then how I went back and like Mo, for example, and his experience of raising Hap, and was really like transformed my understanding. And Mo then became incredible. I identified very much with Mo because my approach to raising my niece is that all I can do is the very best for her. And she may never see me as a parent. She may never see me. And that's none of my business. I just have to be responsible to her. She's a defense, needs to be in every opportunity. And whether she resents me, or whether she doesn't see me as a parent, or if she does, it's sort of out of my hands. And Mo, I think, really, I almost wrote a character that I hoped to be, which was like somebody who was completely selfless, and who was able to show up to the responsibilities of raising a child that wasn't his, and without an expectation of anything in return. And that's what I hoped for myself. And so I think Mo became a kind of repository in some ways for my aspiration as a parent.
Mm. Can you imagine to put the story, I mean, let's talk about the end of the day, in another place and in another time? Because in some way it's very universal story about universal things, right?
Yeah.
But not only the context, this is very important.
Yeah, I think, it's I think there's much of what goes on between the characters. Like I don't imagining it outside of the United States. I don't know that, because class matters so much. Race matters an enormous amount. Like all of these aspects, they're very place specific. I mean, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is where a lot of the book takes place, is a town that had fascinated me. It's where my husband is from, and so I'd never been there before when we started seeing each other. And here it is, this town that used to be this like booming steel town, like really responsible for creating most of the steel that existed in the world at the time. And there was a lot of money. There was like a grand hotel. There were all these things, and then it completely went bankrupt. And for reasons that had nothing to do with what was going on in the town, but were going on sort of in the world, the company went bankrupt. Most of the town plunged into poverty. and they like have been trying to recover from that ever since. And I just thought, like, you know, there's so much here. There's just so much here that's so fascinating. And so, so in terms of like the characters who are there, so much of like the family and what shapes them is also just where they are and what the particular history of that place is. And so, so I think I can't really. It's hard for me to imagine, really. I think any of them in a different time period or a different place, because so much their place and their period, what's happening in the world, shapes them so profoundly.
You have an agency, as you said, and it's also interesting because on one hand you represent the interests of the other authors, and you are a writer, and so there are a lot of aspects, I should say to listeners, to viewers, that and the website is the cleggagency.com, and Bill represents, for example, Lauren Groff. You absolutely probably know her, and among others, of course. But the question is, if you could say a few words at the beginning, how do you work? Because it consumes you, as you said, a lot of time. It's like a normal work, but probably, you know, this COVID-19 changed a lot also, or maybe not. I don't know. How does it look like? Because it's also interesting, because in Poland we still don't have many agencies like that. So it's quite new thing.
Well, I'm very lucky that that the job exists, because I'm qualified to do nothing else. I love it, and I mean, as you can see right now, like this whole desk is covered in.
Oh my God!
I know, and it's things that I'm editing and clients that I represent. So you know, one of the things that when people say, like, how do you learn to write, and I always just say read. And so and I think for my job in particular, what's been so helpful, I didn't start writing until, you know, I was in my 30s, and like my middle 30s, and so that was, but I had been working in publishing, and along for the process of writers, great writers, you know, writing a draft of something and then hitting a wall or having a problem and then having a breakthrough and then writing the best thing they ever wrote. And I'd been through that process enough times, like as a witness and a steward, that I also, it showed me that things that are finished like this, when they're finished, that there's just a whole empire of effort that goes into it that you could never imagine as a reader. Like, and so writing is really hard. It's also really lonely. And so when you bump into problems, you know, I know many people who start and they're just like, I can't do it. It's not for me. But I think I watched people struggle and then have breakthroughs, and even sometimes struggle for years. And somehow that gave me permission, like when it finally came time to write, especially fiction, like it was just sort of like I sort of approach without any expectation. I'm curious. I start writing into something and exploring it, and then it just starts to unfold. And then if I hit a wall or if it seems impossible, it's just like it feels like the end, but it's not. And so, and I think being able to read as many writers as I do who are writing right now, go through that, it's sort of, it gives me comfort that like the process is not perfect, and sometimes you have to step away from something for years before you return to it, and that's okay. That's what it needs. So yeah, I also like, I like getting away from what I'm writing for a while. And so I only write particularly in the generative period when I'm creating something initially, I'll come up here to the house for a couple of weeks or a week or a long weekend and sort of shut the door. But then I might not come back for another 4 months. But stepping away, like it's still, once it starts to exist, I'm thinking about it. It's sort of hovering underneath other thoughts. And so when I return to it, I often know much more than I think I know about it. The unconscious has done a lot of work for me in the meantime. And so I'll see it in movies and in other things that I'm reading or music. And then when I sit down to write, it's like, aha, that what I didn't see before, the solution that wasn't available to me now, I can see it. And so I have a lot of patience for it because I also there's very little pressure on it. Like I have a job, I have a day job, and it keeps the lights on. And so my writing can be this very private place that I'm sort of working out a little puzzle for years, like by myself, and nobody knows about it. And I kind of like that.
So you're lucky.
Feel lucky. I do, Barry.
But the last question is about, because you said, and I totally agree, that if you want to write, you have to read.
Yeah.
So who is your literary master? Who do you love to read the most?
Oh, I go back. So I read a lot of poetry for pleasure, more poetry than I do fiction, because I read a lot of memoir and fiction for my work. I work with writers only who I love, so it's a joy. But so for pure pleasure that has nothing to do with my work, I read poetry a lot. I go back to the same poets a lot. W.S. Merwin is a poet I read all the time, and I'm constantly stealing from him even as I speak. Like I'm conscious of words and phrases and images that come from his poems that just fly out of me uncredited all the time. And so Merwin to me was I think about his writing all the time. So I also love Thomas Hardy. So in terms of like fiction as a bedrock of kind of like what the project of what a novel can do, Jew the Obscure I've read many times, and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I love the epic of what I love the big themes that he engages with. I love the audacity of some of his plot points. I love Thomas Hardy. So.
Okay, so Marwin, good to know, because for all the readers, I have to say that from Marvin's excerpt, the end of the day starts. Thank you, Bill, for the meeting and for conversation. I hope that we will meet next time somewhere in Poland. You are welcome, or in the United States. Why not? And thank you for not only for the conversation, but also for your book. And I'm waiting for another one.